The growth mindset is absolutely like vital if you're operating in a realm where you're striving for perfectionism. Because if you have the fixed mindset, as soon as you fail, like that's it. You just decide, okay, well, I have achieved my maximum limits. This is as smart as I am. This is as fast as I am. I get no smarter. I get no faster. That's all I get. Whereas if you have that growth mindset, um, you can push through. You recognize like, okay, well, I'm just not running hard enough. I'm just not thinking hard enough. I'm just not working hard enough. Like
Okay.
you can have can't fail missions, but like if every mission you're doing is can't fail, you either have the world's most stressful job or you're not applying that language appropriately.
So as we're going through this leadership development, as we go through our journey as leaders, we are understanding that we want to be the best at what we do. Well, today we're talking with a leadership expert, a person who studied leadership since day one. Not only is it part of his journey, but it's also in his career progression as he's a doctor of organizational change and leadership. Also, one of my good friends that I had the conversations with for so long about leadership and how we can do it better. Let me introduce you, Dr. Jason Harris, also Lieutenant Colonel Jason Harris, United States Marine Corps Commanding. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Landmine. It's great to be here, brother.
Yeah, I miss you. I love having our conversations. For the audience to understand, Jason and I have been together since 2006 when we really got to know each other. We were roommates in Iraq, and most of the conversations when we couldn't sleep was pretty much leadership-based questions, I believe.
Oh yeah. I was the boot lieutenant. I checked into the Purple Foxes, what was it, maybe 8 weeks before we went out the door. And so yeah, it was great getting paired with a guy who you were going out on is that your second or your third?
My third.
Yeah, your third. So, the experience and kind of like, great role model to learn from, both on the ground and in the air. And then I kind of ended up following you for a bit of my career. I took over your maintenance shop, airframes there at 364, and then I followed you over to the training squadron as well. So it's been good.
Yeah, and then you got to do some great stuff. Like you got to go to England, go fly with English, and actually go fly at wartime with English and lead them around, which is an incredible testimony to your leadership prowess for the fact that you were able to lead a foreign organization when not too many times Marines get that opportunity.
Oh yeah, and to today's topic, kind of like the pursuit of perfectionism. It was kind of an interesting dichotomy because I was on a task force, a numbered task force. So you would have this expectations that the pursuit of perfectionism would be very, very high. But at the same time, there was just a kind of like a more relaxed can-do attitude. And the Junglies, the British squadron that I flew with, kind of their nickname were the Junglies, had a phrase they liked to break out, and it was no cuff too tough. So there's nothing that they couldn't just do off of the cuff.
Nice. So bringing Jason in here today to have a conversation about perfectionism, because we can see it. We both talk about how we see it in our organizations and people we work with, that it's got positives, it's got negatives, the advantage, disadvantage. And what does that mean for a leader on their journey to achieve greater goals, but without being detrimental to their teams or detrimental to the people they're leading?
Yeah, so kind of when I think about, the idea of perfectionism, I think kind of the first thing that you need to land on is like at what level? If we were looking at a problem and we're looking at either a macro level or a micro level or anywhere in between, like at what level are you looking for perfection? And I think one of the things that comes out is, especially because those different levels of the problem pertain to the different people within the organization. And I would argue that not all levels of the problem should be the focus of the leader. So, we talked about Sinofin's framework of simple, complicated, complex, chaotic. And I would argue almost that, if there's a problem in your organization that's operating within the realm of simple, that those are for your workers And then as you move into complicated, those are for your managers. And the leader, I think, needs to be hanging out in the complex realm, looking at the organization, looking at establishing the vision of the organization, and then recognizing, what are the internal or the external changes that are gonna influence whatever the solution to the problem comes. So I think kind of like the first thing when I think of like perfectionism is I think of two things. First off, I think of like, well, the nature of the problems that a lot of us tackle, like the problem changes halfway through solving it. So I think perfectionism implies a sort of like stagnation, or it is solved and I never deal with the problem again, which we can talk about later, but I don't think you see that like in leadership challenges. But the other thing I think about is like at what levels is something perfect?
Right. And then that goes to the question, do we need perfectionism in our organizations, or does it harm us? And that's where, my question is, the balancing, in which all great leaders we've seen have balanced that dichotomy that we talk about is, do I balance, do I push them to the challenge of being 4% better than they are now? Or am I harming them, give them a break, and let them rebuild, regroup to a place where they can then achieve greatness?
Yeah, and so, because I think you're absolutely right. Like, you can't throw the idea of perfectionism out completely, because, at the other end of the spectrum, you just have, settling. And you see the idea, like, there's multiple theories of like learning and theories of leadership that talk about pushing ourselves. I've forgotten the name of the author, but it's on the motivation of learning, and it talks about how learning needs to be effortful, and so that implies that I'm striving for more. You look at I think it was Burns's model of transformational leadership, and it talks about setting high standards for the people that you're leading, and holding them to those high standards. And so there we see like kind of something, a couple of models that are in favor of at least leaning towards perfectionism. Where I think it becomes dangerous is when it is the pursuit of perfection in either a situation that is changing, because then I don't think such a thing as perfection exists, or when it's a pursuit of perfectionism at the expense of everything else. So at the expense of other tasks or other problems to solve within your organization, at the expense of the morale, the motivation, the climate of your organization when it comes to your people. I think that's when you can get into a place where like perfectionism, or the pursuit of it at least, is definitely doing more harm than good.
Okay. So do you see advantages by having some type of a perfectionist attitude towards things that allow people to step up to the challenge?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a fan, and I've forgotten who said this originally, but we don't rise to the occasion. We default to our level of training. And so this from a life of assault support, that we strive for perfection in landing on time and on target. 0.02 nautical miles now off of the landing site. And so what's that, like 60 meters? And then within 30 seconds of timing. And that's a fairly high standard to hit. And also, as aviators, yeah, okay, 0.02 is the standard, but I'm aiming for 0.00. And yeah, plus or minus 30 seconds, but I'm aiming for like right on the dot. And if not for that motivation, I don't think that we would push ourselves in training to establish that baseline capability, levels of performance, if you will, that we then can default to when the situation arises. So I think there is absolutely room for it in perfectionism, and I think it goes beyond, I think, military leadership applications as well. I think anything where you're looking at high levels, life or death situations. So if you were to look at surgeons, I would wager that those individuals strive for perfection in everything they do. And I think even, if you were to apply this to a business, leaders should be striving for perfection, because they may find themselves in positions where failure means failure of the business. And so it's not just, the failure of the business, it's the loss of the livelihood for all your employees, which is, if you're a leader, you should be caring about your employees.
Right. Can building your people's confidence still live in an environment where perfectionism is trying to be evolved? I mean, just because
Yeah.
like you're in the aviation training now, that you're in command of an aviation training unit where you're pushing your young pilots, your young crew chiefs for that next level better, but you're still trying to keep them confident in their abilities after they've achieved their wings of gold.
And so you kind of bring up a little bit of an idea there that came to me after our initial conversation is, are we striving for an absolute perfectionism, or am I striving for something that is like relatively perfect? And what I mean by that is, so take the students that come through my organization, right? And we're teaching them to fly this new aircraft that they've never flown before. We have training standards for them to meet before they progress from flight A to flight B to flight C and so on. The standards that are established for them are grounded in the realities of the situation and the understanding of like, hey, you don't have 500 hours in this airplane, you have 5 hours in this airplane. And you have less than 200 hours total of flight time. So even if they are relatively perfect in meeting the standard for that one flight, the absolute perfectionism is far down the road. But that idea of absolute perfectionism, the highest of the high standards, kind of pulls them along. But I think by setting relative perfection, like, hey, these are the goals for today's training event, that's how you make something like attainable. Because from your studies that if a goal is not attainable, either because of external asset, or the individual feels they don't have the knowledge or the skills, like that's going to impact their motivation. That's going to impact their ability to learn or actually accomplish the thing.
Right. So your experience being, starting at the bottom and actually achieving one of the highest qualifications that a marine aviator can get, how does that extreme perfectionism pull you along? So when you're in that environment of absolute perfectionism, that allows you to still be able to have that growth mindset and not feel defeated.
Yeah, so the growth mindset is absolutely like vital if you're operating in a realm where you're striving for perfectionism. Because if you have the fixed mindset, as soon as you fail, like that's it. You just decide, okay, well, I have achieved my maximum limits. This is as smart as I am. This is as fast as I am. I get no smarter. I get no faster. That's all I get. Whereas if you have that growth mindset, you can push through. You recognize like, okay, well, I'm just not running hard enough. I'm just not thinking hard enough. I'm just not working hard enough. So that's there. And then I think as well, like, from being at WTI is the idea that, so one, there's the weapons and tactics side of the WTI qualification, then there's the instructor side. So on the weapons and tactics side, it's about the individual's level of knowledge and performance. And you're just constantly learning. You treat it like any professional treats their profession, is you have to stay in the books because things change. So you're in this constant state of learning, but there's also like an intrinsic motivation to keep pursuing that perfection, because the standards to attend the school are high, the standards to graduate the school are high, and then there's only a few of you in a squadron, so the eyeballs are on you. You wear a distinct patch, so there's a lot of like intrinsic motivation to continue to better yourself and pursue perfection. So that's one thing. And then on the instructor side, it's constantly about building the next student. And so like, hey, an understanding of like, I've gone through all of this training and I've logged all these hours to develop me. So like, here's my idea of perfectionism and here's where I need you to be. And I bring you up there. But I think the other thing that goes into it that allows us to kind of maintain an absolute perfectionism while achieving stair-stepped relative perfectionism is in the culture of aviation, the plan, brief, execute, debrief model, where the assumption going into it is there is always something to debrief. And there's always something to debrief from the point of view of like, hey, we need to make sure that the young gals and young guys in the ready room know what was done right so they can put that in their tool bag of, hey, that's how it's done. But we also, I think, recognize, because of the fundamental, the impossible reach of perfectionism. Like, perfectionism exists in theory. There will always be something to debrief. Always. That's the nature of the beast with what we do. Because again, we're operating in the realm of the complex and the complicated. We don't really dabble in the simple.
We can actually de-weaponize absolute perfectionism by the fact that we know that there's probably 100 different ways to skin that challenge. And like, aviation itself, there's like, we do it this way because this person did it and got lucky. Well, there's probably 2,000 ways of doing it, but the debrief allows us to explore those after we've had some experience with it, whether it's successful or whether it's successful or unsuccessful, for the ability of us having the, or for us to create that environment of growth, to think about, okay, what if I did it this other way? What are the ramifications? Yeah,
you've got to remove the fear of failure, right? We can't exist in a zero defect mentality. Now, depending on where you're working, and this is something I've briefed my team on, is like, we are in aviation. There are hard truths. Okay, gravity is a thing. You cannot waive or defer gravity, and so there is such a thing as unacceptable failure. However, there's also, below that iceberg, there's a lot of acceptable failure. And so by allowing individuals to feel that it is, at times, in some contexts, okay to fail, okay to fall short of perfectionism, you can encourage that growth mindset. You can encourage experimentation, which is vital to Kolb's experiential learning model. And actually, even if you go to a military model, Boyd's OODA loop, if you look at a full-blown, drawn-out version of Boyd's loop, the A is not for act, the A is for action. And actually, and I've got it pulled up over here, so I'm cheating a little, but it says in parentheses, it says test underneath it. So it's the idea, and the decision is also labeled as a hypothesis. So there's that idea that, I actually don't know what is going to happen. And if you don't know what's going to happen, you can't be sure of the outcome, so you can't be positive that your action is perfect.
Well, that's what's funny. So, when we were growing up, cause and effect was the big scientific model of how we see the world. Nowadays, as we've grown into our intellectual learning, it seems like influence and impact is more of a direct or stronger correlation than cause and effect is, for the simple fact that the world's not perfectly efficient. And in an engineering term, the world's not perfect, right? And so as we try to go to these perfectionist ideas, but yet we're living in the complex of the model, how do we let the young leaders, the growing leaders, know that you can fail, you can be good, you can be confident, and you can have a little bit of narcissism, and it's okay, because now we're in a society of extremes where we say, we want you to be confident, we want you to learn from failure, but we don't want you to be a narcissist. And it's like, how
do you balance that? So I think it comes down to setting priorities, and I think it definitely comes down to the language that leaders use. So, mission priority, right? For us, our old language of, routine, priority, urgent, mandatory. But in other businesses, or in other organizations, in other contexts, it can maybe be too tempting to use the phrase this is a can't fail mission. Okay. Like, you can have can't fail missions, but if every mission you're doing is can't fail, you either have the world's most stressful job, or you're not applying that language appropriately. And so I think it's on the leader to be very precise with their language of, hey, here is where we have the room to fail. Here is where we don't have the room to fail. And so, you can't be the leader who cries wolf. because then you're gonna beat your subordinates down, and they'll feel like they can't fail at anything. Now, but it's twofold. It's got to go beyond the language, right? There's got to be action that backs it up. So if you're operating in that part of your world where you've told your subordinates, hey, this is where it is okay to fail, you have to hold to that. Like, it has to be okay if they fail. And one thing I brief my people on is, because we don't want to fail, but I think you can mitigate that with timing. If I have 4 weeks to accomplish a task, and I may be tempted just to do it myself because I know I can do it right, it will meet my perspective of absolute perfection if I do it, right? Or I can give it to my subordinate and like, oh, they're going to do it. It's not going to be good enough. I'm going to have to go back and like tweak it with them. Well, like, there's room for that kind of failure if you forecast it and if you execute it in enough time. So I think there's a couple of things like that with like how a leader can like run that balance, because, you know, within my context, like breaking airplanes and bending airplanes and breaking people, that is the unacceptable level of failure. And so we do all the risk mitigations and tight controls to prevent that. But on the flip side of the house, you know, one of my pilots is like, hey, I want to teach crew resource management, but I want to do it in this like totally different way. And he's like, I have no idea if it's going to work, sir. And I was like, hey, go nuts. Because if it doesn't work, we could just teach it again.
Right.
Like, that's perfectly acceptable room for failure there.
No, I like that. And I like the fact that it's, you know, opening up, you know, getting away from this is how we always done it mentality that, you know, military or large organizations, I'm not going to say military organizations, but it's the large organizations that have been successful over the years, like a GE who had somebody like a Jack Welch who was military, and, you know, hey, these are the things that have always worked for us, you know, and it's like, I get that, but at some time, you know, the technology changes, the things change, you know, that tour we did in 2006, we're like, hey, we need to figure out a tail gun mount, and 19-year-old Lance Corporals like won the design amongst thousands of people that put in designs, and his design was basic, simple, and realistic for the challenges we were facing with trying to defend our back side of our aircraft.
Oh, and yeah, the Gucci mount, as we called it.
Yeah.
The name of the Marine was Gucci. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a great example of like where the pursuit of perfectionism actually would have been damaging to his whole concept, because if I remember it correctly, like, we might have skirted the rules in like sourcing the scrap metal.
Yeah.
Right? So if we had held to perfection, he never would have collected the raw material. Mm-hmm. And then his original mount, because we couldn't drill holes in the ramp, so he came up with this like sandwich mount that shut down part of the rollers, the cargo rollers on the ramp. Mm-hmm. And so there's an immediate compromise to the aircraft, which if we were in the pursuit of perfection, we would have not accepted any compromise. But actually what we ended up with was a great capability that went on and became kind of the model and is still in use, you know, today, even though the aircraft he originally built that mount for is long since retired.
Oh yeah.
That's a perfect example of where perfectionism would have been the danger to innovation.
Mm-hmm. I also thought was great about Gucci was the fact that it was not that he didn't have a not give a shit attitude. It was we gave him a message to Garcia type order.
Yeah.
And
we gave him intent.
Yeah.
And just let him operate within it. I think the perfectionism can really drive micromanagement as well. Yes. You know, if the leader has their idea of, and here I'll give you an example just from my organization, because we're in the midst of I'm trying to drive a change initiative. I'm trying to establish, and we're there now. We've boiled it down to the tasks, so we're going into the orders writing, the transition phase, if you will, and establishing a long-range plan that will take the command out to September 2025, which is actually 6 months after my planned departure. And there could be things where it's like, hey, I just want the place to look new. I want the place to look like a modern college campus. I could come in and say, I want the TV on that hallway, and I want 4 stripes in the hallway, and I want them these colors. And that's just micromanagement and is no good. Or I can just give the intent
Mm-hmm.
and let them come up with it. And maybe that individual's idea of what color the hallways should be doesn't match with mine. So maybe it's not perfect to me, but it might be perfect to them. And so if we let it go, settle for like the relative perfectionism, which was, I want my hallways to look nice, then we're good. We don't micromanage the individual. They don't feel like they failed because they actually didn't, right? Failure to read my mind is not failure.
Right. I hated when we had a boss that says, Landmine, you're supposed to come in and tell me some things I want to hear. You deal with the things I don't want to hear about. And how's that set a tone? If you probably heard that too from the same guy. How did that tone settle with you?
I mean, what you've just told me is that you don't want to hear about failure. You only want to hear about what's going right. Outside kind of maybe the bounds of this conversation is essentially what you've told me is that you only want to hear things that are confirmatory to your worldviews, your preconceived notions. And frankly, I think that's not where the leader needs to exist. Like, if you're the leader, you're the problem solver. You're supposed to be the one who has the vision. That vision has been built by, theoretically, all of you have more experience than everybody, maybe more like formal education, but definitely more experience and a better understanding of the problem. That's why you're supposed to be the leader, to establish the vision. And if you tell people to only bring you the things that you want to hear, then there's a fundamental problem with being the leader at that point, if that's what you're saying to your subordinates.
Right. And so that perfectionism now settles into everyone's mind, in which now they're really not going to tell you when shit hits or when things get really bad.
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely.
That's what not kills careers, kills people. But even in
and then other things too. Like, I mean, it's the emperor. The emperor's walking around naked, and nobody has the fortitude to tell him that they're not wearing any clothes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not even that the leader's making a bad decision. Maybe it's just that they're making not the best decision, but everybody's just going to roll with it and accept suboptimal outputs.
Oh yeah.
Because the leader essentially has crushed all conversation about it. When you talk like perfectionism in what? Mm-hmm. Is it perfectionism in trying to hit the landing spot dead on? Is it perfection in landing on the right time? You see this in the students, because in the V-22 in the Osprey, the glass cockpit, right? Very high fidelity for your performance instruments, so your airspeed, your altitude, your power setting, very, very, very high fidelity. Whereas coming from glass aircraft, getting
Mm-hmm.
steam gauged airplanes, like you're like, that looks like 80 knots. But with the students, because they can see if they're 79 or 81, and they're in this pursuit of perfection, they just fixate. And then as a result of fixating on trying to make one thing perfect, the other three things fall off and go way outside of standards. And it's like that, I think, in any organization. If you want something to be perfect, you just have to recognize that you're going to have to prioritize it as such, using the proper language, and recognize that other things are going to fall off of the plate. Like, you can't have perfect adherence to any one thing without it just taking time and resources away from something else within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you say that, because remember when you and I were going through that transition school, the instructors that we call them purebreds, the ones that were, right. They started in, they didn't give you that option as a transitioning guy to not be exactly on the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Versus now that you have instructors that have multiple aircraft under their belts, and they're teaching, hey, big picture.
Yeah.
Where you at in this, where you at in this procedure? Where you at in the performance of this aircraft, and how do we get you there?
Well, I think like, as the leader, right, it's always our job, if there's time, to explain the why behind something.
but not
And
at the
so,
time.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, at 100%, it depends on the context, right? Like if you're in crisis management, I'll tell you about the why tomorrow. But
Mm-hmm.
right now, I just need you to do the what. Um, but if you need something to be perfect, you've got to be able to justify it, and you have to be able to explain that why to your people. But then also, like likewise, if it's okay for something to not be perfect, I think it's also important to explain, hey, this is why we can accept a little bit of variance here. And so, because then you're allowing the people you're leading to kind of develop the sight picture instead of just like memorizing what has to be perfect and what can be not perfect. They're actually like learning the why, and now you're empowering them to make those decisions themselves.
So can you give the why way ahead of the crisis, as you're developing the courses of action, the implementing the plans, just by reinforcing the why up front to allow those moments where you don't have time to explain it? Or does it get lost because of the crisis?
So I think it depends on the nature of the crisis. So developing the why for a crisis, I think. So you could do it a couple different ways. So you could do drills,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can essentially rehearse the crisis, and that way you can roll the crisis out at your convenience, and slow time, and you can lead with, hey, this is why we do these steps when we're in the crisis. So that's potentially like one way. But I think the other thing is, if as a leader you've established a good vision, and everything you're doing within your organization, every non-crisis action you're taking is marching your organization towards the vision and accomplishing your mission, then the why behind your crisis management actions should be kind of self-explanatory, because everything you're doing in the crisis is to overcome whatever the barrier or the obstacle is to still accomplish your mission and like achieve your vision. So I think if you've been clear about those and you hammer those, and there's no such thing as over communication, but if you're anchored on your vision,
Mm-hmm.
then I think then that maybe can provide the why in crisis mitigation when there isn't necessarily time to like remind everybody about why you're doing something.
Right. No, and that's where, some people, they get, when they see how military leaders interact with their people, they only see the tail end of the process of what's going on. And that's where I was kind of concerned about with that view of perfectionism that, young managers get when they find that their director or their boss is a previous military, and then they're like stuck in their head that my new boss is a perfectionist because they relate to what they see on TV, or they see the tail end of the process that we grew together as a team by explain or no, we were given the why, we developed a plan around the why, and our courses or immediate actions or game plans are developed off the why, and it feels like it gets lost to people who've never lived in this environment, that the why is not the tail, the why was actually the lead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And and there's a lot of research that's been done too on like the stereotypes of the military and military leadership, people conflating the leadership styles of basic training with how we operate Monday through Friday, in which is that's just not sustainable. Look at how often we have to cycle out drill instructors because of the tempo, which is something that again they're in a pursuit of perfectionism with very, very high standards, and so there's also we talked about prioritizing things to make sure that you're only tackling what's important. If something does have to be perfect, recognize that it's going to take resources, mainly time, money, focus of attention away from other tasks. But I think something else that needs to be addressed, because leadership is the business of people, is like what are the actual like personal impacts of the pursuits of perfectionism. And you can see it morally, mentally, and physically, that it's difficult. I tried as when I was the operations officer for a reinforced squadron, an aviation combat element on a MEU. I tried, and I had my peers constantly telling me, Chrome, dude, you can't fight everything. And I was like, yes, I can. I just don't have to sleep. And I worked my tempo, my daily battle rhythm on the deployment was like 08 to 03. And the only time I got more sleep was if I got myself onto the flight schedule and I made sure I had enough sleep to operate safely and legally. But like 08 to 03 over the course of 7 months does a hell of a thing to the body. And I definitely paid for it.
Right.
Like, so, yeah.
Definitely.
And it was all self-induced. It was all self-induced pursuit of perfectionism.
It is, but at the same time, now that you recognize that, what have you done anything differently during that time?
I don't fight things. There's lots of things I don't fight.
Okay.
And particularly what I'm trying to do as a commanding officer, and I have to warn my people about this because, one, I think everybody thinks they're different, but I think I'm different than a lot of CEOs. But my action is actually it's an inaction, and it could be misconstrued as inattention and apathy. But I don't fight for information in my current role. I don't fight to know everything at all times. That's the biggest thing I've relaxed and given up on. And what I do is I focus on like looking forward and seeing where the organization is going, trying to forecast the barriers or the complexities that are going to impede that. And then I'll go find out what I need to know in order to inform those future decisions. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'll fight for information if I'm in crisis management. I'm faced with like a very short-term decision. But the rest of everything else is noise. And the reason I say I warn my folks about that is because it could come up, like there's probably some very, very basic questions that you could ask any commanding officer and they would know the answers to. But like right now, I have no idea what the two tail numbers of my airplanes that are in phase maintenance are. And I don't know because I have no decision related to that information. I didn't put them in phase. I'm not taking them out of phase. My maintenance officer is executing all of that with my intent, and they understand that. And so because I've been able to just like essentially accept a massive failure, which would be my boss asking me, Chrome, which two airplanes are in phase? And I'd be like, I don't know, sir, I'll get back to you. So I release that, and it frees up my time and my attention so that I can go towards maybe not, again, recognizing that I think perfectionism exists only in theory, but I can go towards it, and I have more time and effort to put into it. And so I choose to put my effort and time into my people, because that's where I'm pursuing, probably my highest standards is with regards to developing my people.
Now, do you find yourself now let's take the two roles, your commanding officer role that you're in now, and then your operations officer, which we all know is like the greatest staff position to lead you to command, or pretty much you're doing the commander's thinking for them, right? So were you more of a perfectionist in being the opso because it's, because you're trying to anticipate everything that the commander has to answer to? Or do you find yourself more as a perfectionist as a commanding officer, making sure that your people are protected from the higher ups?
So I think looking at that, it's a great question. And I am 100%, I am not the same person as a CEO that I was as an OPSO, which is probably a sigh of relief for everybody who works for me. I was an OPSO, for a long time, 2015 to 2017. Which is a long time to be an OPSO, you know this. Mm-hmm. And then I didn't become a commanding officer until 2023. So like 6 years, 3 different duty stations, multiple different jobs, and some formal education all sprinkled in there. A kid, lots of life changes have made me a very different person. I was 100% more of a perfectionist as an OPSO. And I think it was because despite being in a leadership role, I was really more focused on leading the resources of the command. I was 100% focused on the utilization rates of the aircraft. and it was all about building a plan. So not building a vision, but essentially building that detailed minutia to fulfill the vision. And so it became very easy to get sucked into the details, and not just the context, but the format and pretty presentations, and absolutely pursued perfectionism as an operations officer. And then as a CO, one, I'm not, because just intuitively, just the job is different. I've done some writing, like I write down my vision, I wrote down my philosophy. I give classes to my ready room, so those things I build, but I'm not the ops, so I don't build a detailed annual training calendar where I go back to like pursuing perfectionism. But also the reason I don't do it is very purposefully, and it's the same reason that I don't constantly fight for perfect situational awareness at all times, is because now it would be so much more of a burden on my subordinates. And I don't want to, and what I don't want them to do is I don't want it to be trickled down. Because like I know if I'm a perfectionist as the commanding officer, it's naturally going to rub off on the supervisors that sit directly below me, because one, they're going to conflate my behavior with my levels of success within the organization. And they're going to think you have to be a perfectionist to rise to that level. Or two, and then two, likewise, like just they're going to have to meet a very high demand signal from me. And frankly, I don't need that from them. I think it would put their focus in the wrong place. I think they'd be more worried about me than worried about the people below them. Right. If I was a perfectionist. So I try to, and it's hard for me because and again, going back to the very beginning part of this conversation, it would be super easy to just be, almost like a laissez-faire leader, and like, hey, yeah, we didn't achieve mission, but hey, that's okay, guys, there's tomorrow. Like, that's not the right answer either. But the pursuit of perfectionism from a leader is just something I think you definitely have to be aware of how you're perceived by your people, and what the follow-on ramifications of that are.
Now that this adventure actually has a great transition with it, leaving the military to pursue the excellence of leadership and the studies of leadership, what were the big takeaways that you saw with perfectionism, just as you were getting ready to transition this and start working more with a more, I'm not going to call it complex world, more chaotic world of just the way the civilian environment adapts to or is handling? Nothing against civilians, I'm just saying the world's just a little different. It's
so I mean, from the folks that I went through school with, which was a tremendous opportunity to like actually meet people with different life experiences. And some of them had very different worldviews. Some of them our worldviews matched right up. I think even them, and they were all in leadership roles. I don't think any of them really pursued perfection. And potentially they were even better about it than I was. Because we're talking about individuals that, a lot of them were moms and dads. Some of them were single parents. Everyone had a full-time job, and then everyone was essentially a full-time student in this post-grad program. And so like the phrase like good enough and satisfice was thrown out a lot. And I think it's because they recognized that, again, pursuing perfection in any one of those pillars of life would come to the detriment of the others. And I did have friends fail to complete the program, and I think I would posit it was because they put their priorities in the wrong place. And then as far as like the transition, any future transition of mine from military leadership to civilian leadership in whatever context that happens to be, I think because of my education and learning about like the various change models, and just recognizing that so much of change is externally motivated, or if not motivated, at least influenced. So I think once you recognize that, I think you kind of give up on perfectionism, because we just recognize that there's so much that's outside of our control. Like, why bother? And even if I do address a problem, knowing that I'm operating inside the realm of the complex, even if I do develop the ideal and the perfect solution to a problem, as soon as I apply it, the system is going to change. And now that solution is either no longer relevant, at the worst, or at the best, it's at least no longer perfect. And so I think you just end up in it, chasing your tail a little bit, if you're just constantly pursuing perfect solutions to complex problems.
So how do you decide where the point of no return or the point of diminishing returns is at, if you were to look at a time model over performance scale?
Mm-hmm.
Where does what are the clues or indicators that tell you that good enough's good enough?
Yeah, so as the leader, establishing the vision, that's your job, right? Maybe establishing the mission, or at least accomplishing the mission, is your job. But I think you need to set like what the outputs are of your organization. If you're in a production field and your mission is to make 500 widgets, then that is the goal. 499 is failure and 501 is brilliant. So if you're pursuing a perfect solution, like as soon as that solution gets you to 500 widgets, could it be better? Yes, but we're going to make the 500 widgets. So that is good enough for government work, as we may have said once or twice in our career. Like recognizing that the temptation of perfection takes time and resources and priorities away from other things. And I cannot remember who introduced me to this phrase. I know I got introduced to it in aviation, military aviation, but it was the JICOP. It was the good idea cutoff point. And that was essentially, we established it. So in planning, planning is a gas. It expands to fill the space that it has available. So if you give somebody 12 hours to plan a thing, they'll use all 12 hours. If you only give them 2 hours, they'll use all 2 hours. So the JICOP was what we came up with to say, hey, at this point in the planning, if somebody identifies a better way to do it, we don't care anymore, because we've reached the good idea cutoff point. We have to proceed on planning or we won't finish. But then tied to that is the gambler's fallacy and the sunk cost bias of, yes, if you found a better way to do it, we're going to dismiss you because we're not going to pursue perfection, because if we do, we're going to run out of time. However, we're not going to fall in love with our own plan. And if somebody discovers or learns something new that refutes or invalidates our plan, then we're absolutely going to listen to it. So it's, again, everything in balance. Like there's no, hey, we hit the JICOP and we're just blindly pushing regardless of what like intelligence comes back with. Like, no, there's always like, well, we're not gonna execute a plan that we know will fail. Right.
It's just interesting because the tour before you came to Purple Foxes, we had a commanding officer, HUD-man, who was great about killing perfectionism amongst the staff, amongst the pilots, and that was the ability to say, the good idea cutoff points are, hey, we're past the point of diminishing returns. We need to exercise this plan and invalidate that it works, or how do we deviate from this model to allow us to allow the action people, the pilots, to make decisions accordingly without getting caught up with what does HUD-man want us to think that we should do.
And that time is vital, right? Because it's the commodity you can't make more of. You only use it, and once it's gone, it's gone. And it kind of reminds me of like, and I relearned this when I went to a ground element, but the 1/3, 2/3 rule, where an echelon of leadership only uses 1/3 of the available time for planning to give 2/3 to their subordinates. And so again, the danger of perfectionism is if they use more than 1/3 of their time because they're robbing from their subordinates. But the danger of not pursuing high standards is whatever they do develop in their 1/3 time, they give to their subordinates and it's useless.
Right.
Because we've seen both. We had an individuals whose the commander's intent, what's supposed to drive everything, the vision of the organization, was essentially described as interpretive dance, and everybody walked away from the table and had absolutely like no idea what the commander wanted them to do. So there is potentially an example of an individual trying to be as free-flowing and as empowering to his subordinates, but it went too far on the opposite side of the spectrum for perfectionism. When they walked away from the table, they had absolutely no idea what they were supposed to accomplish.
Right. And we see that a lot with leaders when their leadership teams, because they're trying to empower their leadership teams to think and all that other stuff, but if they're not part of the problem framing process,
oh yeah,
I believe that's where most of your troubles start, is that not being involved in step one, because we depend, as the leadership team, we all depend on the leader's experience to help draw out or tease out the perception of the mess.
Right.
I think General Mattis was great about that when we, getting ready for the invasion of Iraq. Was his experience was he sat with his regimental commanders, and he sat with his ops, and he goes, "This is what I see." And then in that time, not even 1/3 time of what he saw, he asked, "What's your interpretation of the mess?"
Yeah.
He gave it out first, and he was smart enough to give it out first to help give them a little guiding directions versus, hey, tell me what you think, and then when you throw it all up at me, it's this incoherent thing versus I'm throwing out my guidance, kind of.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in General former Secretary Mattis, there's a perfect example, I think, of a guy who gets that right balance, because, by throwing out the idea, just even the word choice of here's what I think, what do you think? Right off the bat, he's admitting that his understanding of the situation may not be perfect. But at the same side, we know like Mattis held people to exceptionally high standards and fired an RCT leader in the midst of the invasion.
My mentor. That was the guy who got me commissioned.
Yeah.
I mean, Gowdy's a spectacular colonel, but because of the perfectionism during the war.
Yeah. And again, comes to where's the context and where is perfectionism appropriate? Where is it not appropriate? Do you seek perfection? Are you process oriented or are you outcomes oriented?
Right.
And I think there's kind of a time and a place for perfection in either of those things. Like there are processes that you have to do in the proper order. And it has to be perfect, because if you don't do it in the proper order, then it doesn't work at all. But again, now we're back into the realm of like, maybe it's complicated, most likely it's simple. And so perfectionism is easier, I'll say, to achieve, and therefore that maybe can be the standard when you're operating like in that role. But when we're coming to outcome oriented, like again, there's a lot of things that stand in your way. Some of them are not even under your control, and I just perfectionism in pursuit of an outcome can maybe be detrimental.
Well, that's interesting too, because I mean, at the base of any operation or any type of goal, it's a human being involved. It's not a machine, it's not a robot, it's a human. And so when we focus on the goal base, we start doing the processes wrong. Let's take an athlete. Let's take an aspiring athlete who just focuses on the 1980s, 1990s, work hard, train hard, for results. If you're not, the day you're not training, somebody else is training harder than you type mentality. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking those athletes are destroying themselves because they're not receiving. So if they don't get a result, they go back to the gym, they go back to the track, they go back to whatever they're working on, and they destroy themselves and not trying to achieve a result because they want to work hard, be hard, versus take a break or take a step back, let's look at it, let the body recover, that's what we did learn as athletes in the 90s was you need recovery time,
you overwork yourself.
And the same thing with any high performing brain, soul, spiritual, whatever. You can suck the resources out of that because of the inefficiencies that are involved in the human body. I have a good friend here at the gym who's Georgia Tech rocket engineer. And
Okay.
one of my first questions to him, growing, as we sit there BSing after the workout, it's like, define trust. And he goes, it's a human fallacy. Because he
Interesting.
thinks in engineering terms, he's a funny guy, but he thinks in
Yeah.
engineering terms. And so it's like, if I were to engineer the human, it's only 5% effect, proficient, or, he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Efficient.
agree
Yeah.
with that. I'm like, so when you build when your team's building these things for SpaceX, how much perfectionism? 99.9999. I'm like, see, and so you get mad. He gets mad at himself when he has a bad workout versus the results of a
Yeah.
competition. Versus
Yeah.
his competition results are always good, but he's always mad at himself for having a bad workout.
Gotcha.
But then that hurts the other athletes who are growing, and I'm over there, motivating them. It's like, hey, I'd rather have a bad day working out, whether 40% of the 40% I have left in my body is still 100%.
Well, in that pursuit of perfectionism, and like you talk about the impacts on the other athletes,
Mm-hmm.
I think another reason you asked me earlier if I was more of a perfectionist as a CO or an OPSO, and I said as an OPSO, and I still, and it breaks my heart that I set this example for those underneath me. But
Mm-hmm.
I had multiple people tell me that they didn't want to be majors and they didn't want to stay in the Marine Corps because they're like, look at how miserable you are. Like, I don't want to be that miserable. And you're like,
Right.
I absolutely set the wrong example. And so another reason I'm not a perfectionist as a CO is because it allows me to walk around with my head up and smile, and I don't yawn in the morning meetings, and I don't have to be the first one at work, and I'm not the last one to leave work. And it just allows me to set a much better example uh, for the organization. But also, we're still like achieving what it is that we need to
Yeah.
get done. So it's not like, oh, I'm not working hard and we're not getting a lot done. It's like, no, I'm just not working harder than I have to
Right.
in pursuit of something that I can't achieve.
Right. And it goes back to what you can control and what you can't control idea.
Yes.
And that's interesting too, because then I'm thinking your base commander, who was one of my last boss before he gave me his job, was big. He didn't understand why his people were always staying at work as late as he was, and I was like, hey, sorry, when you go home, they'll go home.
Yeah.
And he's like, but I have stuff to do. I'm like going, sir, you're a commanding officer, you live on base, you're nearby, they have houses out in town, what if you took off at 4:30 and then because that you want them to take off at 4:30? It doesn't mean you can't. I mean, other than classified materials,
So
you
log
can.
on at
Yeah,
home.
exactly. It's not like you're having confidential or classified conversations at 4:30. You're more like, the sky is falling. The sky is falling. How do we get support type answering,
Or
right?
I can finally, I'm out of the office. I can finally write my performance evaluations. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that was like, I think that was the toughest thing for Slimer to when he started putting that in play. It went along with his people, and I remember Turley coming to me, Smash, saying, I'm glad you said that to him. Overall, what we're saying here is there is no right or wrong when you deal with perfectionism. Is that something we agree on?
I would agree with that there is no right when it comes to perfection, but I would still argue that like the blind pursuit of perfectionism can be wrong.
Okay.
I think high goals, absolutely. High expectations, yes. Accountability to individuals to meet those expectations, absolutely. But I think you sacrifice too much in pursuit. If such a thing as perfection even exists, you sacrifice too much in pursuit of it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the effort is not worth the results.
Yeah. Diminishing returns. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what are the things that a organization that has this perfectionist attitude that wants to change or create change within? How can they best approach changing their culture in which they're no longer being this perfectionist, low results, and being a good enough, get more results?
Yeah. So I think it's got to start at the top.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to start with the leader, modeling that behavior, accepting failure where you can, and setting goals that don't require perfectionism in order to achieve, and then holding then subordinates accountable to reflect those same values. That will take time. You'll see that in the climate before you see it in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think other things that you can do as a leader, if you're really trying to like embed that culture within your organization, is, generally the tools for an organization to like continue a culture or shift a culture are generally in the policies, because policies are what outlive leadership and outlive billet holders. So policies that go towards tolerating failure. So be it your human resources policies, or maybe it's just what your output standards are. And then likewise, if you don't need to have a policy for something, don't have a policy for something. Don't set more and additional standards if at the end of the day they're not absolutely necessary for meeting mission vision. I would say those are maybe the two biggest things. So something fuzzy like the leader, modeling that behavior in the language that they use, and then that, all those things that you want being reflected in this within the structure of the company, i.e. policies.
Okay. No, that's great. I'm glad that you were able to have. Sorry, I sprung that question on you out of nowhere, but I'm glad you were able to have such an insight on that, because it's something like most people are like going, I don't know, how would I do that? And it seems like you've gone through this thought process a lot harder than most people have.
Yeah. And then when all else fails, I mean, the Disney film, just like let it go.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you teach some people that in my life?
I think what helped me a lot, like in kind of, because like I said, I was not the same person in 2017 that I am now. Mm-hmm. And I credit a lot of that education to the job I held at Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group, because almost everything we did was a war game, and a war game against like somebody else who mm-hmm. desperately wanted to win. And so you kind of rolled in there with like, okay, well, there's not going to be such thing as a perfect solution, because the person on the other end of the map is trying to beat me. So they're going to confound me. They're going to frustrate me. They're going to try to defeat me. And recognizing like the things I can control, the things I can't control. And if I can't control it, I'm going to respond to it, mm-hmm. but I'm not going to get emotional that it damaged my plan. I'm just going to let it go.
No, and that's, quite profound of understanding what is, controllable and what is not controllable, but also having the grace with yourself to understand that you have influence, and you have influence and impact, and you have cause and effect. Mm-hmm. And yeah. That kind of, when somebody has that insight, it goes a long way. But at the same time, the combat environment is pretty much a reflection of life. It's just more amplified and more with decisions have direct consequences, immediate consequences. Yes. Direct, immediate consequences.
Yeah, but immediate and final.
Yeah, immediate and final. So by keeping it, in a complex world, by keeping it simple, that kind of helps take away some of that perfectionist's environment or culture, because of the ability to be agile and have grace for the people that are out there doing it for you.
Yeah.
So yeah. As I'm reflecting upon last 5 years of what we've gone through, of how some leaders will want to inhabit our lifestyle without going through the trials and tribulations that we had to go through to have that mm-hmm. mentality, and understand where this comes from. So as leaders now, as we're coming out of this environment and going into the different environment, mm-hmm. how do we show people that we're still still in charge of. We're still leading for high standards, both out being perfectionists that they think when they see military.
I mean, again, I come down to like the language you use as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
and the behaviors that you model. I think, modeling empathy, modeling understanding, modeling forgiveness. And you can do all those things as a military leader as well. And a lot of times we do. And again, it just like that's not the Hollywood portrayal of the military leader. And also we don't necessarily model those behaviors in the combat environment either. But when you can, as often as you can, and then obviously after you've made your transition, and I think if you were to model those behaviors, that would, I think, put your subordinates at ease of potentially, working for the retired Marine perfectionist.
Mm-hmm.
If that's something you're looking to mitigate.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I appreciate you having this conversation with me, and
Thanks for having me.
oh, yeah, I look forward to having more conversations with you as we continue our adventures, in self-growth and things like that. But your insight's always important to me. Your reflect your bouncing ideas off has always been important to help create a necessary not advertisement, but just bring that information aware to others, that where it isn't about leadership isn't about being the guy on top who gets control all the resources, but they get to be the person that people want to be around.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks Eric for inviting me, and keep doing what you're doing, brother.
I'll try to, man. I'll try to. And if you want to see any future videos, stay in touch with here, as Jason and I will probably be doing a few more ideas as we get through this year. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you guys next week.